Hi, Dina here, and I painted this misty mountain landscape in another video, and I wanted to use this as an example of a couple of different paper types. So I painted this on Fabriano 25% cotton paper. It is a great paper to use to practice watercolor for warm-ups and for wet on dry technique. Now, we're going to be comparing that today to Arch's 100% cotton paper. Now, this is much more expensive paper, but you're going to see that the results are quite different. So here's our original painting, and I'm going to use that as a reference photo to paint a similar, not quite exact, but similar painting here on our Arch's paper. And I'm going to be using the same supplies. So our supplies are going to be this Jean Haynes Master Artist set from Daniel Smith. Specifically, I use the colors Nickel Azo Yellow, Aussie Red Gold, Moon Glow, Undersea Green, and Lunar Blue. And I think I used just a tiny bit maybe of the Green Apatite Genuine, but just a little bit in this foreground mountain. I have those squeezed down into a little pan, and we'll also be using a porcelain mixing tray. And then I have two brushes that I'm going to use. I'm going to use this Blick Red Sable brush in size 8 and this silver Squirrel Quill Blend brush in size 10. I'm going to set this picture over here so I can kind of use it as a reference, and we're going to use a watercolor pencil to just sketch out our mountains a little bit. And so I'm not going for necessarily exact. I don't like, replicating exactly, but we'll go for a very similar feel for the painting. So here's our background mountain. And we'll paint that, or we'll draw in that big mountain in the foreground. Just going for a very loose, very loose, rough sketch here. The nice thing about using a watercolor pencil when sketching is that this color is mostly going to melt away when we add water. So we're not going to have quite as many pencil marks if we used a regular pencil. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of add that last layer of mountains. And this one kind of faded into the mountains below and gave way to one more. There. All right, so here's our mountain scene. And we're going to start with the sky. For the sky, we're going to primarily be using the Nickel Azo Yellow mixed with a tiny bit of that Aussie Red Gold. I'm going to use this quite wet. Now, when I painted on the Fabriano paper, everything dried pretty quickly, and we were able to kind of jump around from section to section pretty quickly. We're going to see here with the arches that the drying time is going to be a lot longer. We might have some blooms here and there, but totally okay. We're getting a little bit of a different style, a different feel from this Arch's paper. But you can see here how smooth the color is going on versus when you're using a paper that's not 100% cotton, you're going to get a little more variation, kind of even unintentional variations here. These are obviously clouds, but here we have some kind of variation of as this paint pools in these kind of pores, where Arch's is textured, but it's going to have a finer texture. All right, so we're just finishing up our kind of hazy, kind of sunrisey sky here. I'm just going to get a little more of that Aussie red gold to put on our horizon. And you can kind of see that this is fanning out and kind of blending on its own, where the paint stayed a little bit more put when we used the Fabriano paper. So this is doing some of the work for us and getting that sunrisey color. In fact, I'm loving this sunrisey color so much. I'm just going to add a tiny bit of the quinacridone magenta into those deep parts of the mountain. Give those the deepest red. All right. Now, because this is going to take a little bit longer to dry, we are going to need to maybe move a little slower, painting from mountain to mountain. So let's go ahead and start with this foreground mountain. And I'm going to do that foreground mountain a mixture of a little bit of the undersea green and some of that lunar blue. So this foreground mountain, we want to look a little bit more green than the rest of the mountains. The rest of the mountains are kind of background misty. I'm going to try to pick up a good amount of that lunar blue on my brush. This squirrel brush holds quite a lot of water, which makes it really great for using with a paper that holds a lot of water like Arches. All right, we're just going to kind of smush some of this on to give the illusion of a tree line. And then fill in the rest. We might add some more details to this tree afterwards. Since this mountain is in the foreground, we want it to maybe have a few detailed trees, where our other mountains are going to be mostly backgrounds. So I'm going to kind of jump to some of these little bit more background mountains. And I'm going to add more of that lunar blue. We want these to be a lighter color, but I want them a little more blue than that foreground. So let's go ahead and it's still looking a little too green. There we go. And I'm making sure my brush is quite saturated with water because we want just a pretty light wash of color right now on these mountains. They're a little bit more in the background. And you can kind of see here that my sky is still a little shiny, a little damp. If I did paint this background layer right now, we might get some blooms. And I don't want to focus on details in this painting. I want this to be a pretty simple painting, so I'm using a fairly large brush. And I'm just kind of scrubbing away some of my pencil line. I don't mind if there's a little bit of a pencil line there, but just scrubbing a little bit of that pencil line away. All right, now for this one, this is kind of like a separate mountain. I'm going to add a little bit of the moon glow, which is like a purpley color. I actually need to squeeze a little bit of moon glow. back into my palette. And I want this one to be a little bit more of a purpley blue. I'm just going for some color variation here with my different mountains. So we get almost like a gray mountain feel from this one. And because we are not so subject to drying time here, since our paper does hold a lot more water, I'm gonna just kind of drag some of this color down so we get a little bit of that kind of misty effect since we have a higher saturation of color up on top. And you can see here what I mean when I say that these are going to stay wet a lot longer. My grayish purple and my blue are kind of bleeding a little bit into each other. I don't mind that so much for this painting, but it is something to take into account. It can take a long time for this paper to dry, especially if you are using very wet on wet style. All right, so for our, let's try to tackle this one. I think my sky is mostly dry. And I'm gonna go for kind of a very pale blue here with that lunar blue. I do love using 100% cotton paper because it is a little bit more forgiving. That if you make a mistake, you can use a paper towel and lift up some of that color. You can put color down and then, wait a second and then move it around. You do have a little bit more time and freedom. I'm avoiding the areas that I just painted the other color here just to give that a little bit more drying time. I probably should have let them dry a little bit more before moving, but I didn't want this to be an hour-long video. All right, so we're getting that background color. Of our mountains down. And we're gonna add one more color of mountains and then we're gonna add a little bit more shadow and detail in a second layer. For my last mountain color, I'm gonna mix some of the undersea green and lunar blue again, but just with a lot more blue than this first. So this one I want to be my deepest green, and then it kind of fades into more bluish colors in the back. A little bit more blue so they don't look quite so similar. And we still have time to water that down a little just to make sure these colors are a little different. We can add some contrast with a layer 2. Watercolor, especially when you're using this cotton paper that absorbs a lot of water, will always dry lighter. I am getting some splatters here. I'm being a little messy with my squirrel hair brush. So we might add some clouds in just like we did for our previous painting. I added some clouds in because I made some splatters. They were accidental clouds. I think we're gonna have accidental clouds again. I do enjoy making clouds though, especially using the lifting method, where you have a wet background and you use a paper towel to lift some of the color. We're probably going to go part that, part just kind of some purpley blue clouds. Alright, so there's our general mountain feel, and you can already see that the colors on here are a lot more even than on this one, where our colors kind of pool in these like divots, pores of the paper, where here our color is a lot more even. So we're going to mix up a cloud color. I'm going to use a little of the Moonglow and the Imperial Purple, maybe some Lunar Blue, just to kind of mix up a color that's a little bit warmer than the color of the mountains. And we're just kind of tapping that with our brush. We're going to get those little splatters that we made cleaned up. And I am going to try using a little bit of lifting with my very dirty towel here. I do like to use this dirty towel. One, so I'm not wasting paper towels, but two, I kind of like when we get kind of that dirty effect with clouds and such. This is primarily what I use this paper towel or this towel for, is when I'm doing clouds and lifting color. Now I'm going to switch to my size 8 round brush, and I'm just going to drop in a little bit more of that color I lifted away on the bottoms. Just to give my clouds some texture. We're going to kind of blend those bottoms in a little bit. And we can kind of just play with it until we get some cloud shapes we're happy with. Like I said, I wanted these to be kind of light clouds, not too prominent. Now, I did have paper towels. I don't own paper towels, but I did have paper towels over Christmas, and I did actually enjoy using paper towels, so maybe I'll have to go back to buying the occasional roll for art. Just getting a little bit more of that slightly warmer purple in our cloud shapes. Going for a little bit of dry brushing to get that fluffy shape. Until we're reasonably happy with how that looks, I'd say so. And now we can start to add in maybe some shadows, some detail here. I'm going to be primarily using the Moonglow and Lunar Blue. First, just mixing those two together to get a nice deep color. And remember, this mountain was kind of a separate mountain. So we're going to drop some color and then drag it down a little bit to blend. It looks like this, maybe the Moonglow or the Lunar Blue is a little granulating, so we are getting some separation, but I do love that for texture here. I'm going to just add in some strokes for texture, and then maybe soften them a little bit with some water. Okay, now let's do this one. Similar color. And similar effects, we're doing kind of the edges. Wash my brush and then dragging down that color. And with 100% cotton paper, it does stand up to multiple layers and scrubbing and beading a little bit better. And as I said, remember, you can use a paper towel or a towel to lift some color. We're going for kind of that whiter look on the bottom for that mistier mountain effect. This one was, I think it was just the lunar blue. So we'll add in some nice jagged blue edges. And then soften those by dragging that paint down. And to avoid hard lines, I'm going to make sure, even if we're just using clear water, I like to drag it all the way down that surface. So basically we're re-wetting that whole mountain just to make sure that that's kind of drying as one piece versus drying separately and leaving us these like harsh water lines. I'm just bringing that darker color a little bit further down. Now I just looked at the time. This video is already a little bit longer than my last video of this same mountain scene. So you can see that it does take a little bit longer to work with this very thick cotton paper. It takes longer to dry. Sometimes it just takes longer because you need more pigment to kind of soak into that cotton. Adding a little bit of undersea green and my lunar blue for these last couple of mountains. I'm going to start with this one over here because this one's a little drier. A little bit more blue in that mixture. I'm going through quite a lot of this lunar blue. I'm probably going to buy the 15 milliliter tube. The set I got came with a 5 milliliter tube. And I'm quite fond of this color, so I'm probably going to get the big tube of it. I do love that Daniel Smith has the paint in the two options, so that way, you know, if you're trying out a color, you can buy the smaller. Some smaller colors, like, never gone through the whole tube. And then, if you like it, you can get the bigger kind of bulk size. Now these watercolors, one thing I will say about watercolor is even these very small tubes last me a long time. Some of my oldest colors, this is the very first set I bought, was the Daniel Smith primary mixing set, and I still have like half of the tube in here, and this is several years old. So with watercolor, they do last a very long time if you keep the tubes covered, and then you're always kind of reusing what's on your palette. So I never wash this. I kind of just use whatever palette dirt is on there for my next painting. Now these don't have the nicest hard edges because I'm kind of using a very scrubby brush stroke here. You could definitely do these with like sharper, smooth edges if you wanted, but I kind of like this kind of jagged mountain look versus something very controlled and tight. But for your painting, you can do yours whichever kind of style or preference you like. Alright, one more painting. I guess we didn't really go over this back layer either. I might go over that one just a tiny bit. And we have this foreground mountain. And I'm really going to try to give this foreground mountain some kind of individual tree shapes. So we get the sense that there are trees on here. The other ones, they're too far away to tell. But this foreground tree is close enough that we can make out some of the individual tree shapes. And I'm just kind of dabbing my brush. I'm going to do a little tiny bit of the, was it green apatite? Just to get a slightly different green in there. So we have a little bit of color variation. As I said, we don't necessarily want individual trees drawn, but just like the suggestions that there are some individual trees making up this mountain in the foreground. I'm just going to kind of flare out the edge a little bit more here. All right. Now I didn't go back over the last layer. So we're just going to go back over those background mountains with a little edge enhancement here. Same method of highlighting the edges and then dragging our paint down. I'm working in relatively small sections just since I'm kind of using a little bit of a drier brush here. We don't end up with our paint drying on us. I'm just going to try to wipe away my mistake there. That is, as I said, the nice thing about this cotton paper is you do have a few seconds to correct mistakes before it dries. So it is a little bit more forgiving than paper that dries very fast. Wood pulp paper tends to dry a lot faster, which is great if you're trying to do wet on dry, not so great if you're doing wet on wet. Fill in our little mishap there. I am using a slightly new setup today, so excuse my bumps into different things. I bump into the camera. I have this long brush, but my camera is not very high up, so a little bit challenging as we get used to our setup here. Alright, so here is our completed arches painting. And you can see if you watch the other video, it is a very similar style, but it came out quite different. Now this paper is very thick, but right now it is very pliable, as this paper is holding quite a lot of water. Versus this paper kind of stayed pretty, it's dried now, but when we were using it still, it stayed pretty rigid. And you can see here we have some different texture and color variations, where this is going to be a lot smoother of a look. This Arches paper is definitely my favorite for finished pieces, and I do use it for practice sometime as well, but I'm getting over this fear of like wasting the quality supplies. I'm sure you've experienced that if you've bought like a higher quality art supply. You're afraid of like using it up. But this is definitely my favorite paper to use. There's a few other brands that I do also like that make 100% cotton paper. Hanmule is another great one. Indigo Art. Those are kind of my go-tos. For this not 100% cotton paper, I do love Strathmore, this Fabriano Fluid. Those are also all great papers that kind of serve different purposes. They make great sketchbook, on-the-go paper. But for my more serious paintings, I do prefer the look and the texture, the feel of this Arches 100% cotton paper. I hope this was helpful comparing doing the exact same painting on two different papers, just to show you a little bit of the difference that your painting material, your painting surface can make in your painting.